All right, we are here for the Locker Room Bonus Show, special guest episode number 1, numero uno, with the one and only Ghost. If you're not familiar with Ghost, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, you know who Ghost is, but he's one of the best, most talented analysts in the space of MMA analysis, a guy who I have been able to learn a lot from, a guy who I've taken inspiration from in this space. So, the topic that we've endeavored to cover today is analysis versus scouting, and just sort of getting into the nitty gritty of each of those and kind of differentiating what makes analysis different from scouting and, how the different applications of each. So without further ado, Ghost.
Yeah, Jesse, thanks for having me. So
Of
really
course,
excited for this.
because I know this is a topic that obviously you and I are both pretty passionate about, and one that I think often gets overlooked or misunderstood by a lot of people. And I think it's fair to say that both you and I want to try and tackle some of those misunderstandings a little bit and make it, maybe even a little bit more accessible to, the average person who might be listening to this podcast, if anyone actually does listen to this podcast. But
Right, and hopefully they learn something along the way.
that's the goal. Speaking for myself, the reason I do, anything that I do in the MMA space is I consider myself decently knowledgeable, at least, especially when it comes to concepts and principles and some of the core fundamental stuff. And my goal is to, educate people to the best of my ability, and kind of make the sport as a whole more accessible beyond the, going, oh, whenever someone gets knocked out.
Right, and yeah, same thing here. I'm still learning the sport, and one of my goals is to help people train or don't train, but when they look at my stuff, I want them to understand the sport better. Because like Fenyo says, when you understand the sport better, it's a lot more interesting.
It really is. Honestly, that's part of what got me so invested in the sport to the point where I'm at right now. Is I started training freshly out of college, started watching the sport, and I was like, ooh, that's interesting. How did he do that? Because, on the surface level, a lot of things seem kind of basic. Like when a guy steps in and wings a huge overhand and gets this brutal knockout or whatever, it's like, okay, well, how did he convince the other guy that, to sit, I don't know if you recall, after Tyron Woodley knocked out Robbie Lawler, the one journalist in the press
Oh yeah,
conference
that
goes,
dickhead
Robbie,
reporter.
did you consider blocking? Obviously, if I recall correctly, Woodley feinted his way in before landing that big shot. So it's to me, that was kind of the turning point of okay, there's definitely something beneath the surface. And as I try to get better at the sport for myself, I want to try and figure out, what that is, how that works, and how these super elite guys can tap into that so regularly.
Yeah, and when I first started, around 2018, I was looking for really good analysis. And the only thing I found out at the time was Joe Rogan, which was unfortunate. So that was
Ooh.
my start. That was my starting point for analysis. But then 2019 onwards, I found Jack Slack, which was a
Yep.
godsend, really. And
Yeah,
Dan
that's
Tom after I still remember this vividly. After UFC 248, I was looking for a lot of content on that because I was a Weili Zhang fan
aren't
way
we all,
after
brother?
way before or when I saw that fight. So I wanted to look for UFC 248 content, and I stumbled onto his Protect Your Neck podcast. And
Shout out to Protect Your Neck.
ever since I've been trying to learn about analysis, trying to up my game on how to look at fights. So yeah, and that's how I got into tape study. So
Yeah.
I'm relatively new to this, if you think about it.
I think we started just around the same time because I started training in 2018. And then obviously I think the most common gateway is stupid Rogan clips on YouTube. And
Right.
after realizing that they maybe weren't the most in-depth or even oftentimes the most informed, I was like, well, there's got to be something deeper here. And then, very similar to you, found Jack Slack and went, okay, there is something deeper. And from then on, I was just not looking back, all gas, no brakes, not looking in the rear view. And here we are, however many goddamn years later. Holy
Yeah.
shit, it's been a long time.
Right.
But so without further ado, let's dive into it. So I think the solid starting point is kind of just discussing what analysis is and what scouting is, and then kind of breaking it down, what makes them different, right? Because they might seem very similar on the surface level, especially, the people who aren't, as obsessed with this as you and I might be. So I'll start with you. How do you view analysis?
So this is a really simple definition. I took this from chess because a lot of what happens in chess, where a lot of the terms in chess actually apply in tape study and fighting.
Hmm.
So simply all analysis is you're just looking over and reviewing past competition.
Yeah. I mean, that is a very succinct and simple explanation to me. The way that I view analysis is, it's to give a perhaps even more simple explanation. It is just the why. It's the why things are happening, with an afterthought being the how, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because you know anyone can watch a fight and do play by play in their head, but it's going beneath the surface level of just seeing what's happening and figuring out, why is this specific tactic working, whereas this one isn't.
Like the ideas behind the moves.
Yep. And like how one, what the interplay between things is. So, actually a good early example for me when I started really trying to get into the striking more so for myself. And again, this is going to date my experience in MMA, is Conor McGregor. This, I started training, I guess it was technically late 2017, early 2018 when I was back on break, and then started full time in 2018. So this was when he still had, that aura. It was like, I guess sort of right before the first Diaz fight, maybe, or it might have even been after. But, you know, one of the things that I was looking for is, how does his game work? Yeah, and obviously he's one that benefited from like a lot of athletic attributes and kind of intangibles in terms of like, his size and everything for the division. But, you know, noticing the way that he was, using his footwork as a means of eliciting response, because he is a guy who, was primarily looking for the counter, for that left hand counter. And I was trying to figure out what he was doing to get guys swinging so wildly so often. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And like to build off of what you're saying with Connor, like you can see how he's setting up that pull counter by driving people back to the fence and then having them lash out. So like again, that's really simple analysis there where you're looking at the idea behind like what he's trying to accomplish in the cage.
Yeah, so that was sort of my first introduction to doing independent analysis, I guess, even as rudimentary as it might have been. Just, okay, this is eliciting a response. What's the reasoning? What's the goal? How does it, what are the mechanisms behind it, as sort of the last tranche of it, I guess. And so then, I view analysis in two distinct categories personally. I view, this sort of holistic, like macro scale analysis of, what the fight game itself is and what a specific athlete's, A game is primarily, as well as like I try to look at what kind of depth they have. But that's going to get into a bit more of the scouting that we'll touch on in a minute, I assume. And then I also look at matchup specific analysis, because, there's a very important element of, how does this person's A game match up with this person's A game? And, it gets to a little bit of murky waters in terms of subjectivity and all that, and trying to project things based on, historical data onto, a completely unknown future.
And I think another like misconception about analysis specifically is I think people think that going into like micro level detail, they think if you just do that, that's analysis, but it's actually not because what you're looking for are the ideas and how those ideas fit an overall strategy. And I think that's a
Exactly.
really important like distinction that we have to make with people just pointing out stuff and people pointing out stuff but saying how it fits the entire game of that fighter.
Yeah,
I think
exactly. And
that's
how
something
it,
that we miss a lot in like people trying to do analysis and people doing play by play.
exactly. And that's like in my own content, which I actually put out very rarely now, as opposed to when I was really trying. I would make a distinction if I was doing, what I called a breakdown versus what I called analysis. Breakdown is just, to me, saying, okay, here's exactly what's happening, with things that you can see with your eye, but, trying to go into a little bit of further detail and maybe some of the technical elements, some of the mechanical elements as to like this specific, shot, this specific, setup or whatever. Whereas analysis is, again, to me, going that level beneath, going to the why is this happening? Why is this working? Why is this what you're trying to do? If that makes sense.
Right. And I think you brought up another term that we should define too is breakdown. Because that I think is something different. Like analysis and breakdown, they go hand in hand because without the breakdown, you don't actually get the analysis because you need to know what is actually happening within an exchange or how that exchange started. And I think the analysis is just the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. I like that definition because it's not necessarily they're not like intrinsically tied together because you can have a breakdown without having analysis, and I think that's where a lot of newer analysts kind of get mixed up, hyper focusing on small details and like I've seen stuff that gets a little bit silly and like the angle that he throws his right hand at here is intended to get through the guard at x degrees or so. Like there's some very
Right,
silly
right.
stuff that floats around, and this isn't me trying to say that these people are like dumb or whatever. It's just I think this is a common misconception of if I go way too granular with the details in what I would consider a breakdown, that will become analysis somehow, which I don't necessarily think is true.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like the people that draw or like PFL putting out breakdowns, like quote unquote
Oh my
breakdowns,
God.
and it's just them saying right hand with a circle.
Yeah, no, that
Like in
literally
Slack, you
happened.
mentioned this, right?
That's real.
In
That
Slack, you talked
happens.
about this, right? Like he said that that's not analysis,
No, no, that's just goofy. I don't know what you would call that
right?
other than like poor marketing. But so I think, there is an even further distinction that needs to be made, and that's the difference between analysis and scouting, right?
Right.
How would you describe scouting as the more experienced professional?
So yeah, like we said, it's scouting is something completely different because you're looking at tendencies and exploitable habits, and your ultimate goal is to shut down that opponent's A game. And like something that's always resonated with me ever since I found out about Jack Slack is you can be the inferior fighter, but if you make your opponent's A game hard to operate, you can give yourself a chance. So that's where I come from when I define scouting.
Yeah, so it's essentially reverse engineering what a fighter's skill set is to kind of get at the core of it, and then taking the step beyond and okay, how do I kind of game plan this? How do we negate their A game? And I think
Right.
that's a phenomenal shout out. That's Jack Slack's Killing the King series, if I'm not mistaken.
It is from Jack Slack's Killing the King series.
Got it, baby. But that's that really is the core of what scouting is. And then one of the things I like to look for, and for clarification, my scouting has been very limited. Like my exposure, my experience with it has been largely just guys in my gym and occasional, regional pros. So obviously not anything to like the super high caliber. But one thing that I always look at is like, how can, to your point, how can we negate their A game while still having, enough plausible ability to apply, the closest version of our own A game, if that makes sense.
Right. And that's another thing. So this is something that I took because I played college football and I played high school football. But one of the things my high school football coach taught me when I started coaching for my high school football team was
Hmm.
if you try to stop everything, you end up stopping nothing. So I think that's another thing people or have misconceptions about scouting. People think scouting is about looking at every single move that your opponent makes and having a counter for each of those moves. But that's not what you're trying to do because if you try to do that, like you'll get nowhere because you're not going to have a strategy because you're trying to stop everything that opponent does.
Yeah, and in
So,
effect, the only thing you're really stopping is yourself. If you're so
Exactly.
preoccupied with, every perfect counter to everything, you're not focusing on your game. You're not focusing on what got you there in the first place. And to use your own earlier chess metaphor, it's, that's like looking for a checkmate on every single move, right?
Right, exactly.
Which,
Looking at every threat that you see on the board and trying to stop it
yeah,
instead of stopping the important ones.
It's not properly applying risk, right? It's not like looking at the risk reward ratio and, getting like the proper sort of proportions, I guess.
Right, and here's another thing I'd like to add. If a fighter loses because they force their opponent's B game on them, and their B game is just as good as their A game, you just tip your hat to them.
Yeah, that's
There's
just
nothing
impressive.
you can do about that. Yeah, that's
That
really
is,
impressive.
yeah, because here's the thing that should kind of, lay the ground floor of where we're at in MMA as a whole. Probably like 75% of the current roster doesn't even have a B game to begin with.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
half of these guys are not the most layered, not the most nuanced, and as a whole aren't adjusting all that well, if at all, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. Because, like, I could say this for women's MMA, because when you shut down somebody's game, like A game in women's MMA, they just implode.
Yeah.
And I think you could say that with most MMA. Like, not many people have a B game, or their B game is like equal to their A game, which obviously that's weird to say, but nobody's B game can be like as good as somebody else's A game, right?
No, yeah. I mean, if it is, I've yet to see it, but I think it would be kind of sweet. I just don't know how possible it is with, just the way that the real world works and the way that, athletes have to train and develop. It's not really feasible necessarily.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, that, and another thing I'd like to add, like this is a shout out for Ryan Wagner.
Mm-hmm.
So what he talks about, like this is again building off the A game idea, is you ask yourself what the high percentage moves is, and then you work backwards from there. I think that's really good scouting.
Yeah, I think that's in my opinion, now that you've brought it up, is like that might be the single greatest starting point, I think, for a lot of people who want to, dive a little bit deeper, get into analysis for themselves, is, looking for the high percentage offense, high percentage defense, even of specific fighters, and trying to figure out how to, again, kind of reverse engineer it, right?
And yeah, and since we're talking about like the differentiating between scouting and analysis, I think that looking at the high percentage moves, I think you solely put that on the analysis end. I think the scouting is working backwards from there.
Yeah, so one kind of needs the other to exist a little bit. You can't necessarily have good scouting without having, a very strong understanding of the analysis of, this specific fighter, right? But I think, to me, one of the things that I look for the most, one of the things that actually was very kind of fundamental in what I consider like my growth as an analyst, is looking for, what makes things not work. So if you have a fighter who has these high percentage weapons, say it's a right hand, to really reduce it down and be kind of simple with it, and, they're knocking everyone they fight out with it, and then they meet someone along the way and just can't seem to get the right hand going at all. I think to me, that's where a lot of the meat and potatoes is, how did you get this specific athlete to behave in a different way than they normally do? What's the mechanism behind it? And, how can that be gamed even further into your own benefit, or, against their benefit for future opponents,
Yeah. And to add what you're saying, like making things not work, like I think one of the most important things to make that happen is have different options to not make that thing work. Like you said with the right hand, there's many things you can do there. You can slip outside of it, counter with a low kick. You can strafe while using your lead hand to control that right hand. I
You
think the
can feign
more
it out.
options you have, yeah, exactly. I think the more options, or for scouting at least, the more options you have, the more chances you'll give yourself of stopping that high percentage weapon. If you get what I mean,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense, because it's, again, to your earlier point, it's not stopping everything. It's not, looking for that checkmate in every single exchange. It's finding what the high probabilities are and assuming, in some part that they will be looking to adapt, looking to adjust, and trying to figure out, what are the different ways to stop. And then I think that's sort of a very interesting wrinkle that I think we can kind of hammer home a little bit, is like almost getting granular in it. Like, because as you said earlier, everything has a counter, at least, to some degree. And it's a
Except
matter
for
of,
pivots.
they don't work. They just don't
Yeah,
work.
they don't
I've
work.
been told by some of Twitter's greatest minds that they don't work, which actually a part of me did want to start this show by getting really into making fun of Twitter nerds, but I figure we can do that for the sequel.
Yeah, we can do that later.
But I think to the point that I brought up earlier in trying to figure out what kind of stifles guys, the specific example I'm thinking of is a guy who I struggled with making reads on for a good long while as I was trying to kind of figure the game out at a deeper level, and that's Rafael Sunsao. I think,
Oh yeah.
because I saw almost all of, well, no, not almost all of his fights. He has a ton of fights, but a lot of his UFC fights, and I saw a lot of the fights of a lot of his opponents, and I was trying to figure out, I've seen TJ Dillashaw find incredible wrestling success against, a lot of his earlier opponents, and seen the way that he turns that into, these longer striking exchanges. So why at points is he kind of pot shotting with a Sun Sao, right? Trying to figure out what the mechanism is there. If you can see, the behavior change, if you can kind of observe that shift to the B game, that's where you kind of have to pinpoint a little bit, or try to.
Right. And the thing about like making somebody use their V game and make the proper adjustments, it's very rare that you actually see them make that adjustment, especially if you have multiple options to shut down that A game. So
Exactly.
I think that's another like complexity to this topic that we're talking about is it's really difficult to adjust your A game or to adjust what the opponent's doing to shut yourself down and make the proper adjustments. Because you're ultimately going to revert to what you know, right?
Especially, because that's one thing that I think, back to kind of our earlier discussion about, so to speak, bad analysis, is there's this kind of preconception that these are active choices in the moment when, 99% of the time, it's like these are drilled reactions. These are things that, you don't want to be thinking when you're fighting at all.
Right.
Everything should have been, you know, hammered home by well before this point. Like, that's why it's so important, in my opinion, to go after the A game, is like, this is what's been working for this guy pretty much since I started training, and has been fine tuned to an elite professional level. So, when it gets a little bit difficult, that's what they're going to revert to, even if they've come in with a very good game plan 9 times out of 10.
Let me just add another thing. So, like for analysis and differentiating that with like, because with analysis, like people say, oh, they're not really thinking about this stuff. Well,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, of course they're not. But
Yeah,
the thing is, fighting, like this should be clear, but like fighting in the moment is completely different from sitting down and looking at every single move that they're doing. Because
exactly.
we have the comfort of looking at a computer and like fast forwarding, rewind, while in real time they are making decisions like splits in split seconds. And like this brings me back to the chess analogy because in chess, like I know this is hard to believe, but like by adding a like timer and adding the pressure of competition, even though we see moves that they can make on the board, that added element of pressure and time makes them make different decisions.
Yeah. And it completely changes the dynamic, right? Like, how many times have you seen someone doing something really impressive in sparring, you know, and then on fight night, there's absolutely nothing of the sort, right? Like, I don't know if
All
that's
the
the
time.
best analogy, but, there's definitely an element of pressure. And I think, a good consideration in at least analysis, and I would assume definitely scouting, is like kind of figuring out the way that, that sort of pressure applies itself, on the
Right.
dynamic of any individual fight, as kind of woo woo, silly mysticism, intangible, whatever it is. Like, there are actual, like, physiological effects of stress and pressure. And personally, I can't think of anything more stressful than trying not to get punched in the face by a professional face puncher.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Just adding the elements of like just walking out. That is an element that some fighters don't practice. Like if there's fighters that practice that, like I know one specifically, and that helps them. But like if they don't practice like being in that environment, that time, they walk out, they get introduced, and then they start fighting, they like all the training in the world doesn't prepare them for that.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure, and especially when it's outside of the apex, there's a lot of people actually looking at you. And I always find things like that to be kind of fascinating. Of like, how is this going to apply itself? This kind of unquantifiable, intangible. But I think that we're getting a little bit off topic,
Yeah,
getting
we
into
are.
the kind of the psychological aspects. But I feel like there are definitely considerations to be made about that, right?
Yeah. But yeah, just I kind of wanted to bring that up because like people think that we're just like showing off by like studying the film and then annotating, but you need like most fighters who don't do that, they don't improve.
Yeah,
So
those
like
are the
if
guys
you
on the Contender
do
Series,
right, those are the guys on the Contender series. But
like
yeah,
multiple
but
times.
if they took the time to review their film, see what they're doing wrong, and then practice it the next time so they don't make those mistakes, that's how they'll improve. And that's what I think. So yeah, that's what I think good analysis is, or for the fighter at least.
Exactly, and I think you know that's not necessarily to say that like just doing tape study will make someone who's let's be honest, not very good. That's not going to be the complete turnaround for them because there are limiting factors. Like, some people just don't pick up information as quickly as others. Some people, can pick up the information but struggle to actually apply it practically. But I think, that is the clearest way that an athlete can grow. And I think that's sort of what can kind of be the primordial ooze, so to be, of a B game, right? Like, watching back your own tape and even watching like the tape of your opponents can help you figure out what is it that I need to do that I'm not currently doing, and what is it that can work for me if this thing that I really like isn't working, right?
And another thing is like for improvement, I know this is different for chess because in chess you can play thousands of games like within the span of like 2 years. In fighting, you can't do that because you have a limited
No.
time.
Yeah,
So that's another thing that we also have to consider. Like even if you spend the time doing the analysis, you don't have the physical resources in the end to see if you can improve.
exactly. And like even in training, again, I'm gonna get a little bit off topic here, but like even if you're making all those reads, really dialed in mentally to kind of the advancements you need to make, some of the holes you need to kind of shore up, half the time you can't actually really work on them all that well, all that hard, because your body can only withstand so much. If you're not a well paid professional, you're probably working a job. So, I think the ecosystem of the sport as a whole isn't exactly conducive to like actually producing elite level athletes most of the time. I think they're the exception, not the rule, and I think that should kind of speak for where the sport itself is at and continuing to trend towards, I guess.
And
But that's
another
a
thing
that's a
is,
whole rant.
yeah, that's a whole nother thing. But like to add on a little bit to what you were saying is like say you do make the reads in your like tape study and your analysis, you're not necessarily going to be able to apply that in your next sparring session,
Yeah,
right?
you you should try. I would advocate for trying, but that's that's kind of the benefit of sparring is like you can try things out and not risk getting knocked out unless you're Kevin Lee at Killcliff, I guess. But by and large, because that's something that I've always kind of seen as like a big issue for a lot of athletes, something that limits their potential. From wrestling, from jiu-jitsu, from MMA, is guys who only work the things that they're good at in sparring. It's inherently limiting, your ceiling, your growth potential, and it's something that makes you very, very easy to figure out by the people who are actually scouting, the people who kind of know what to be looking for, I guess. And
Yeah,
I
and
find,
yeah, to add, like, you need to fail. Like, to get better,
Yeah,
you need to fail.
yeah. Whether it be in training, whether it be in the cage, how many guys have lost their first number of fights and gone on to become, elite level fighters?
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah, there's a fair few. And even the guys who, well, guy, singular, who never lost, wasn't winning every single round of sparring every single day from the time he stepped on a mat. That's, people, I feel like lose sight of that in all of their
Right, right.
appraisals of, Dagestanis in particular.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think we should move on to like some scouting
Yes,
definitions,
you
right?
have, yes, I'm going to
Or
let you
scouting
take the lead on that.
examples.
Yes.
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
you came
So,
prepared. You always
all
do.
right. So, so like, so some of the things that like again like differentiating analysis and scouting, like surface level analysis, like for Volkanovski, you people consider him an elite striker, right? But even within that specific aspect of his game, he has tendencies within that aspect.
Yeah.
Because
And
like
tendencies
most people, the
are
way they
exploitable.
here, go ahead.
And that's the point. Oh no, I was
Right.
just saying, to your point, tendencies are exploitable by definition, and that is sort of exactly what, we're kind of looking for, right?
And the thing that I've seen like a trend, like not the elite tier analysts, like the guys that we look up to,
Hmm.
but like maybe in the betting community, I'm probably gonna get crap for that, but
Good.
they just look at like striker versus grappler. Oh, this guy's a striker. Don't strike with him. Go shoot a takedown. Right? That's the type of surface level analysis that I'm talking about. But
And there's
like
a lot of it,
even in
unfortunately.
even in striking, wrestling, grappling, everybody has tendencies and habits that prevent them from or that that you can exploit and make them do something else
Exactly.
within that range, right? Like Volkanovski, for example. I just said he's considered an elite striker, but if you watch all of his fights, when he jabs in, every time he jabs in, his main defensive move is to lift his lead shoulder and then move to the right. That's something you can exploit. That doesn't mean that you avoid striking with him.
Yeah, you're not shooting a takedown, and you know, it's something that you kind of know he's going to do. It's always been there for him, and even if you are ostensibly playing into his hands, you have made your read and you're making the attempt to apply it, right?
Right. Yeah, and here's another example. When he's strafing to his opponent's power side, he's like he's reaching with his lead hand and then he's strafing. But when he strafes, he blades his lead foot inward, so he's not in a position to deal with low kicks. And you saw Topuria exploit that multiple times, right? But again, even that, there's multiple counters to what he's doing. Like it's not just just low kick him and then he'll implode. And I think that's what people in our space think like there's a specific button that you press and that guy will just explode.
Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of people kind of come in with all these video game metaphors and sort of like video game, I guess, trained approaches to, yeah, I guess we can call it scouting. But, obviously that's not how it works in practical application or even in theory or anything like that.
I think the only example that has like what's his name? Edson Barbosa. I think that's the only person that has like a button that you press and then
Yeah,
he
and
implodes, and that's
instantly
apply
implodes.
pressure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Shout out to Jack Slack.
even then, that's something that like he's actually tried to adapt for in recent years. Like that's why he's sort of developed his pocket boxing a little bit better. Is like he knows everyone who has ever watched any of his fights, which should be everyone because he's awesome. We'll just try to get him on the back foot and then watch it crumble.
Right, exactly. Now, I was going to ask you, do you have any examples that you'd like to bring up?
So I think my examples are going to be a little bit less sophisticated than yours, but that, I think that kind of speaks to our dynamic. I think you're a little bit more sophisticated than I am, and that's where we're
Oh, well,
trying to
thank
get
you.
at, of course. But I think from a recent performance, something that I thought was very much worth noting was so to touch on the topic of process a little bit. I know Miguel Class and Dan Albert did a huge like
Yeah,
2 hour
fantastic
long
piece.
podcast. Incredible. I just listened to it a couple days ago. If you haven't, you should and subscribe to the Miguel Class Patreon. Process is in my opinion, it's kind of I think the way they described it was the cohesive tissue that holds a fighter's game together, which I think is a phenomenal description. So if process is viewed as the cohesive tissue that holds a fighter's game together, it's fair to assume that that comprises their A game as well as a lot of the sort of ancillary things that they have built into it. So one of the more striking recent examples of that, in my opinion, is Marab versus Umar, right? So what does Umar like to do a lot is, especially in response to pressure, as we saw against Corey Sandhagen, is he likes to kind of show the wrestling offense as a means of creating that kind of barrier to step back to his preferred kicking range, because that's how he sets up, all of his lead hand weapons, which are sort of like the crux of his pocket boxing. And so what you're seeing Marab do, if I recall correctly, is using a lot of little head feints just to get him, thinking about the shots of Dvalishvili, as well as, kind of realizing, all right, I can't necessarily show the shot as well because the first line of wrestling defense is the head. So if you have a guy who's already showing you kind of up and down movement, it should give you the read that, he's ready to stuff your shots at a moment's notice. So, while that can build into its own offense, it's not necessarily the specific approach that I think Umar is typically looking for. And that kind of kept him more on his heels than I think he would have liked to, especially, in the second, third round moving forwards.
Yeah, I think those are great points right there. Because like you said, like the constant level change preventing Umar to resort to his wrestling to get that pressure off of him.
Yeah,
I think that's a great point.
To expand a little bit, his game is so, it's nuanced in its own right, but it is very structured in its layering, I feel like, in that, he needs a lot of those longer weapons, like a lot of his step-up kicks, his front kicks. He needs a lot of that to set up his jab, set up his lead hook, get guys looking to cover a little bit more range from, outside to the mid-range to inside and kind of skip that intermediary a little bit. That's where he's finding a lot of his, like, step-up knees, lead hooks, stuff like that. And an element of that gets guys guessing a little bit is just that mix-up that he presents in terms of, I can flick up this high kick just as quickly as I can show you this level change and get in on a single, on a double, whatever. So I think his game is the cohesive tissue is just that degree of nuance, and should one threat kind of unravel for him, it seems there's a little bit less holding the rest together, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Right. Yes, and I kind of want to add to that, like that idea of range. So, like, as you know, I've done an article on the positions of striking.
Yep.
And
Phenomenal,
I think
by the way.
to help, yeah, and I think that would help a lot of people understand, like, when, like you said, like when Marab's doing that level change thing, like what range is he doing? Is he doing it at borders? Is he doing it in the pocket? Like, if he's doing it at borders, he wants Umar to see that level change, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point.
If he's doing it in the pocket, he's most likely trying to get his head into Umar's chest. So, like, I think that's another important distinction that we should make, like, in and out. When you're watching fights, like, understand the specific positions. Like, where are the feints happening? Is it happening in the pocket? Is it happening in borders? Are they doing it too far, like what Macy Barber used to do? Like, stuff like
yeah.
I think that's kind of like the thing that will help more people understand, or like get more people that want to do analysis, like having a structured, like seeing the position of the cage, seeing what range they're operating at. I think that will help them elevate their analysis game, quote unquote.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, and that's actually something that I'm going to now incorporate into my own approach a little bit more, because I think that's a very key point, is like looking at the where things are happening. Because yeah, I think it's fair to say that, like, different fighters will have different looks, different tools that they prefer, at one place in the cage versus another. You see sometimes guys will, I think Volkanovski's actually a fair example. As he's getting backed up, he'll like to pump his jabs out a little bit more as he's trying to get onto that, weak side angle. And I think you can see that a little bit more frequently as guys are finding success backing him up. Whereas when he feels a little bit more comfortable with the pace, with the pressure, with the positioning, that's when you're seeing more of the, step up feints, a lot of the, hand trapping and stuff like that. And I think that's the other key point in that I think is like really worth hammering home is just, when something is being shown intentionally, like to the Marab example, if he's out of borders and showing you the level change, there's a purpose for that. There's a reason that he wants you to see that at that range, because that, can differentiate things moving forwards, either from that range or from other ranges. And it's, it's all a process of kind of fatiguing the decision-making systems is the way that I like to put it.
So like to bring that idea back to scouting, like I think understanding like borders, for example, whether any athlete or any fighter knows this or not, they all have tendencies at that specific range. Some of them don't even know that range, like Mackenzie Dern. But yeah, every fighter has tendencies at borders, like whether they're feinting their way in, whether they're crashing through that distance,
Yeah.
whether they're trying to circle their way out or trying to get the rear side angle. Everybody has tendencies at specific positions, and like I think a good scout would try to figure out what their best position or what their most relied upon position is and what their high percentage weapons are from that position.
I think you actually raised a point that I think is a very, very important consideration, and that's, what are the subconscious things that people are doing? Like, everyone has their little tics, their little habits that maybe they're not even consciously aware of. And I think that's where a lot of like exploitability lies. Like, I think one of the sillier examples is like the rhythm step where out at borders or even like a little bit out on the outside, guys will kind of just do a little bouncy bounce for no real reason other than, that's what they do in training. That's what they've kind of always done in training. And that's where they feel comfortable when they're not really doing anything, I guess. And there is a lot of exploitability in that. And, another one that's a pretty recent example is Adesanya's defensive reactions that cost him against Imavov is, I don't think that's a conscious reaction of Izzy. And as much as conscious reactions are a thing in fighting, as we've kind of alluded to, is like most things you don't want to be actively thinking about. But, a subconscious little error of his, like a very exploitable habit, is just that reaching out with both hands. And that's what Imavov was able to capitalize on with that, the way that he switches stances a little bit lackadaisically. And that same defensive framing intuition, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about that a little bit more, because that's actually interesting. Because there's not, and Wagner made a whole thing about hand trapping, right?
Mm-hmm.
About double hand fight.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually nothing wrong with what Adesanya's doing there. It's what's happening when when opponents proactively grab his gloves, and that's forcing him to reset or change stances. And again, like you said, I don't think that's necessarily like something he's thinking about. That's just a habit that he has. Like with Strickland, when he grabbed both hands with when he was reaching out with his lead hand and Strickland grabs both of them with both of his hands, like instead of attacking the side that's open, he'll just reset and try to change positions because he doesn't like where he's at.
Exactly.
I think that like you said, that's an ingrained thing that he has, and that's something that you can exploit.
Yeah, and I would argue that's something you should exploit, but sometimes it's easier said than done, of course. But
right.
That's the game, I guess. We're at about 50-ish minutes now, so I think this is a good point to call it, considering it's longer than the 2 episodes of this show that I've put out so far combined. But I think it gives us a very good point to kind of continue on at a later date, because there's a lot to talk about, and we can get very, very granular with things, especially I'll actually be able to prepare a little bit more.
Right. I think our next episode should be on initiative.
Initiative I think that's a very great shout, and that's something that I'm very strongly opinionated on. As you know, I've written a little bit about. I think that's another misunderstood concept. or at least misrepresented concept in MMA specifically.
And there's been a lot of good pieces on initiative. Like Heavy Hands did a whole episode on it. And
Oh, really?
I think it'll be a good chance for us to talk about like how we view it.
Yeah, because it is a very interesting concept, and there are a lot of different kind of approaches and sort of permutations that it can take on. But I think it is at its core kind of the fundamental backbone of what dictates any fight one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think that's
All right.
another element that I would like to touch on in next installment.
Next episode,
is positioning, because that's
positioning. Yeah, we kind of
one
touched
of-
on it a little bit. Not
Yeah.
so
not
initiative
in
and
great
positioning.
detail. Yeah,
Because I
that's
think
gonna
those
be-
two do go hand in hand.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like a lot of things in the sport of MMA is like one kind of can't really exist without the other, even though they might get separated at times. I think there's a lot of things that tie together very closely, and there's like a tremendous amount of interplay between every different wrinkle, every different facet of the sport. But
Right, just like scouting and analysis. Ooh.
hey, there it is, baby. That was awesome. All right, so I'm gonna call it there. If you're listening to this, you already follow me, I would assume. Ghost, they're probably following you as well. But you got anything to plug?
Yeah, so you can follow me at 9H6ST21_MMA on X, and that's where I'm the most obnoxious.
Yeah, buddy.
Everywhere else, I try to just post good content, unless you're being a dick, and then then I'll probably screenshot that and post it on X. But yeah,
Exactly.
so everywhere else, I'm Phantom Punch Breakdowns, and make sure you join the YouTube so we can take it to the people that shut down my original one, and
Haters,
which is
dude.
at Phantom Punch Breakdowns, and my Substack, where you can get a lot more analysis, because my YouTube is just the animations with some breakdowns. On my Substack, I have in-depth articles, I have in-depth videos, where all my content where at. So make sure you subscribe for free. And if you want to support that area, if you want to support the Substack, that'd be great. But you'll get extra stuff. But most of my stuff, I'd say like 80% of my stuff is free.
And the free stuff is phenomenal, and I will say, as a patron, the paid stuff is truly, honestly incredible. And like, I cannot say enough how much I've actually been able to augment my own knowledge by just reading everything that you're posting.
Thanks, man.
For the record, I do also have a Substack that I'm trying to use more. So if you don't know that exists, you can check that out at combatwrapup.substack.com. But we're going to call it there and get back to initiative and positioning, two very, very important concepts in the not so distant future.
Yeah.
All right, my friend. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
You were the man. I'll catch you.